Welcome everyone to our climate and health session. We're really excited to have Dr. Natalia Linos today. But before we start, I would like to provide kind of the context for why climate and health is so important for climate advocates, and history about the FXB Center. And then I will introduce Dr. Natalia Linos. I also want to say thank you to FXB USA board members who were able to join today, as well as some of our climate ambassadors. These are outstanding alumni who are serving in an advisory capacity, helping to shape the strategy of the FXB Climate Advocates Program. Some of them are also here today. So we have, in addition to our credible Fall 23 FXB Climate Advocates who come from over 50 countries, with a wide range of ages, and are working on climate action projects that directly or indirectly impact and benefit individual and community health in their communities. So we know that mitigating climate change has a positive impact on health. So this is a really critical intersection that we're eager to explore today. Young people are living the impacts of climate change. They're living the health impacts of climate change. And this is a really urgent topic that youth climate advocates are not always exposed to, yet they have lived experience with. So this is why we include climate and health session as part of the FXB Climate Advocates Program, because we want to provide a framework and tools and resources for youth climate advocates to become climate and health advocates, and to really understand how addressing climate change also has very co-benefits and powerful impact on health, and how those two topics are interlinked, even though it may not always seem so initially. So first, I would like to provide a brief history about the FXB Center. The Francois Xavier Banout Center for Health and Human Rights was founded and endowed by Albina Dubrara-Ray in 1993. Her goal was to provide protection to children by furthering the vision for health and human rights. The FXB Center uses interdisciplinary approaches to promote equity and dignity for those oppressed by racism, poverty, and stigma nationally and around the world. The FXB Center partners with a diverse group of scholars, educators, elected officials, and government agencies to advance health and human rights and to show the harmful effects of violations on children. And for FXB International, for the broader FXB family, the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard is a really critical partner and a member of the FXB family to really help us bridge the gap between practice and policy and advocacy. So we work very closely with the FXB Center on climate change and to support our work in the field on our international development and sustainable development programs. So today I'm really honored that we have Dr. Natalia Linos, who is a social epidemiologist and serves as the executive director of the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard. And Dr. Linos will share with us the intersection of climate and health and provide some tools and resources for youth advocates to promote health in their communities while working on climate action. Dr. Linos has over 15 years of experience working at the global and local levels on some of the most pressing health challenges of our time, from climate change to systemic racism. Since 2019, Dr. Linos has helped build a new research area for the FXB Center focused on racial justice. Along with Dr. Bassett, Dr. Linos co-leads the two largest programs in this area to create an actionable field of scholarship on structural racism and health, and make the public health case for reparations. These efforts build on their work together, including at the New York City Health Department and research on the social, legal, and political determinants of health. Prior to her role at Harvard, Dr. Linos worked at the United Nations for over a decade in diverse roles. From 2016 to 2019, she led United Nations Development Program's work at the nexus of health, climate change, and the environment. And she's using that knowledge and experience to expand the FXB Center's work and partnerships on environmental justice and climate action for health equity. Dr. Linos has a strong commitment to public service and bringing public health expertise into political decision-making. She's very involved in her community and serves as a member of the Brookline School Committee member and on the town's Advisory Council on Public Health. She also serves on the board of Environmental League of Massachusetts. Dr. Linos is a 3-time Harvard University graduate, earning her Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology Master of Science in Social Epidemiology, and Doctor of Science in Social Epidemiology at Harvard. She also holds a certificate in forced migration from Oxford University's Refugee Center. And just some fun facts, Natalia speaks Greek fluently and speaks many other languages such as Arabic, Spanish, and French. So Dr. Linos, we're really happy to have you, and you've been a great partner for FXB Climate Advocates Program, and so we're just really thrilled to dive deeper with you today on climate and health. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Karina, and you really didn't need to read a long introduction, but I am delighted to be with you this morning. My hope is, even though we have 80 people on this Zoom, is that it will be really interactive. So I'm thanking everybody in the chat who's sharing which countries they're from, and it's such a delight to see that there are people from Rwanda and Morocco, Liberia, Benin, India. You know, it's a real delight as someone who worked at the UN. But now works in an academic institution in the US. I really miss that diversity of perspectives and opinions. And so tremendously excited to have this conversation with all of you. I have slides, there's PowerPoint slides, but my plan is that throughout those slides, I will stop to ask you questions. And I really do think that learning from each other, the ideas and the thoughts will be really important. I'll ask you to put things in the chat, but also, you know, if you're brave enough and want to participate and your internet allows, to raise your hand using the Zoom, you know, the Zoom reactions. And Karina, you can help me in sort of calling on people, because I really think that an interactive, I'll be with you for a bit over an hour. And I think if you were just to listen to me lecture, you would probably get tired. So please participate as much as you can in this conversation. So before I start my slides, I do want to ask you, in addition to what country you're from, to think about the word that comes to mind for you when you hear climate change. And that can be a word, any word. So I'm going to ask you to just take a minute to, if you haven't put in what country you're from, you can say Greece and X word. And I'm gonna be looking at the chat. So put in a word that comes to mind when you think about climate change. Distress, I see Karina's word. I saw my parents. Impactful, okay. Emergency, that's great. Damage. Disappointment and disaster. Destruction. Future. Urgency, transition. Real, Greenland, uncaring, emergency. Climate hazard. Someone talked about a blind person dying in a disaster. The greenhouse effects. El Niño, more damage. Land pollution. There's also pollution more broadly. Climate change is real. Yeah. Loss of food. Health impacts. Okay, I was waiting to see if anybody would think about health. Dangerous, unhealthy. Obviously, disasters and damage and loss of life are all related to health. Mental health issues. A lot of people talk about anxiety and distress. Those are mental health issues. Reproductive health impact. Pronto, I'm going to want you to jump in during my lecture, because often people don't consider that. Oh, end of the world. So there is a lot of distress that comes with a discussion on climate change. And my presentation is going to possibly be distressful. You know, the numbers, when you think about the health impacts, it can be add to that anxiety. So the first half may feel pretty heavy. And the second half, I hope, will turn into, you know, what are some of the solutions? What are some of the actions? Because I do believe that there's hope. If I didn't believe that there was hope to turn things around, I wouldn't be in this work. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now. I will ask to make sure that you can see it. And I will switch. Oh, it's making me give a password to share my screen. Let me check that, Karina. Hmm.
Yeah, you were able to share. Now we can see it. Yeah, if you just want to put it in slideshow.
Now, okay.
Perfect. Yeah, this is great.
And it's okay, wonderful. So, as I mentioned, my session objectives are twofold. One is to explain the ways through which climate change threatens health and well-being, and specifically how climate change impacts both intragenerational and intergenerational justice and human rights. We are a Center for Health and Human Rights. And then to turn to solutions and discuss ways that communities, practitioners, policymakers, and youth can advocate for political action to advance climate action and better health. And as I put here, this will be interactive. Please do participate because that will make this session much more interesting. And I start with a picture of my daughter, Amalia. She's 10 now, and she's holding a poster that reads, "The climate crisis is a public health and medical emergency." So until pretty recently, I would say until the last 10 years, people weren't using the framing of public health and climate as a health emergency in a lot of the advocacy work. A lot of the advocacy was happening by environmentalists, climate scientists, really talking about trends for our planet, ecological destruction, things like that. The health lens has been more recently being incorporated for two reasons. One is that we know more about how climate change impacts health directly and indirectly. And second, that there is increasing literature that people are motivated to act around climate change if they understand how it impacts them, their families, their friends, more so than how it impacts, our geographies, our land, our water, or our weather patterns. It becomes much more tangible. So the point of today's lecture on health and climate change is to give you tools to talk about those health impacts. If people are pushing back on, why does it matter, being able to describe some of those health impacts is pretty important. So I'm going to start with a question. I want to know how many of you can before I even present you any of the materials, can think of some of these health impacts. So I'm asking you, in what ways do you think climate change is impacting your health or the health of a friend or a family member today? And you can write a couple words or sentences in the chat. I'll give you an example. If you live in Delhi, you might say, "I have seen air pollution or extreme heat impact my community members." If you live in a country where you're seeing more floods, or many of you put damage and disaster, you might want to explain how that links to health, whether it's loss of life or something else. So I'm giving you 1 minute to put in some ideas. And for anybody who's brave, asking you to raise your hand to share with the group orally too. So the question is, what way do you think climate change is impacting your health or the health of a family member? I see already a brave person in Angel Nanyaro. Karina, can you unmute Angel? Yeah.
Go ahead, Angel.
Thank you. Good evening from my side. It's evening. It's actually night. It's 8:45. So hi everyone. From the question, what ways do you think climate change is impacting your health or health of a friend or a family member today? I am in India, and I would like to say that water pollution and air pollution. In India, I come from Gujarat, and the water is really polluted, and also they don't have the drainage system, whereby a high percent of kids, they have diarrhea, and that's what also we're working on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angel. Those are very important points. So you brought up air pollution, water pollution, diarrhea is the direct impact that you're seeing. I see in the chat, Karina talked about asthma and breathing. So a lot of the air pollution has a lot of respiratory conditions, waterborne diseases. Food insecurity is a big one. Wildfire smoke impacting the respiratory health, smog. Okay, so we've identified, spread of communicable diseases during floods. Elsa, that's great. And food insecurity, heat stroke during high heat days, flooding, and Omar talked about mental health problems such as anxiety and depression. All right. And increasing temperature leads to skin diseases. Stella, that's a really interesting one that people don't often. So you've captured quite a few of the ones that the CDC organizes. So in this table, if you look, the CDC has this graph that I think is a pretty powerful kind of visual. And I'm going to spend maybe 3-4 minutes on this visual because this really is a really good summary of the health impacts. And let's start with extreme heat. So that's in the upper right quadrant, extreme heat. That's one that we're seeing increasingly to be an issue across many, many geographies, but especially in places that were already facing, hot days. And extreme heat is something that causes heat-related illness and death, as somebody talked about in terms of heat strokes, but also cardiovascular diseases. The rising temperature and extreme heat is one that often people point out, and they talk about, for example, in Boston, where I am, this year, there were 3 or 4 days where schools, teachers in the schools were thinking about closing down the schools. Our schools don't have air conditioning because Boston historically hasn't had extreme heat days, but teachers and children were complaining about the extreme heat. But obviously in countries, including India and places across Africa, extreme heat is really an issue of life and death if you don't have adequate shade, adequate hydration. The rising temperatures also are leading to a lot of drought and environmental degradation. Somebody had put in the chat, the mental health impacts under environmental degradation, people being forced to sort of move because they can no longer take care of the land. Then we move to the upper right corner, which is more extreme weather events. So what we know from climate change is not only that we have an increase in temperature, but we also know that extreme events like floods and extreme amount of rain and other sort of natural disasters are becoming more frequent and more unpredictable. So there is exacerbation of existing social and inequities and vulnerabilities because of the extreme events. And clearly, a lot of the extreme events cause direct death. When you have a flood or a disaster, people die, and they don't die in equal numbers. We're going to talk a lot about equity in the next slides, where I'll jump into that. But also changes in vector ecology. So, for example, when we think about how, the whole area of zoonotic diseases, whether we're talking about Zika or malaria or dengue or West Nile virus, these are things that a lot of communities have had to deal with, but increasingly places that have never had to deal with them. For example, Mexico City is going to, at some point, have to deal with malaria and other diseases when just because of the temperature increase becomes, new geographies become able to allow for these vectors to spread in much higher rates. So it's really changing the way that public health has to think about what their populations are at risk, because you may live in a country that has never had a problem with malaria, but because of the change in the climate, the weather, the heat, you will in the future. So you need to start planning for that. In the chat, a lot of people talked about air pollution and increasing allergens and really the respiratory health, whether it's through asthma or respiratory allergies. But interestingly, the WHO talks about air pollution as impacting so many other, cardiovascular disease, but also air pollution having an impact on infant health. If, for moms who are exposed during, we're learning a lot more about the direct and indirect ways that air pollution impacts health. Water quality, often people don't bring that up. So I was delighted to see that diarrhea came up, food-borne diseases, cholera, and other sort of, because of the water quality, there is a real threat to health because our water is being affected, not just by the rising sea levels, but also the acidification in the oceans, and, is changing a lot about the quality of the water. And finally, on the bottom sort of left-hand side, the increasing CO2 levels are impacting what I was just talking about, water and food supply. So the increasing CO2 is directly impacting the acidification in our oceans, which is making fish and, having an impact on fish and the quality of the nutrition. Even for our agricultural practices, increasingly public health scholars are finding that the nutritional quality of food, because of CO2 levels having increases, is decreasing. So the wealth of kind of minerals and vitamins and the micronutrients that you need to have a healthy, nutritious life, CO2 is negatively impacting that. And finally, the severe weather I mentioned earlier, which includes injuries, fatalities. So this graph, if somebody was to say, let's summarize all the climate and health impacts, this is what the CDC, which is the US Center for Disease Control, has tried to do to summarize. Now, in the rest of my lecture, I'm going to try and talk through a few of them in a little bit more detail, but also, just know that you can go back to this as sort of to capture the diversity. I think when people say climate change and health, people often think respiratory health, but forget about everything else. And this is to show you that it's really complex and many, many interactions. So the one that I want to take just one more minute thinking about is climate anxiety. And that is one that even the CDC, if you notice, it was just like one piece under war and conflict. But I think even outside of the scope of war and conflict, what we are hearing increasingly is that young people are, and I saw it in the chat, so a couple of people did talk about it, are feeling a real sense of distress, a real sense of depression and anxiety about what the future holds. And that is manifesting in many ways. Asking someone, what do you plan to study for college? A 12-year-old, I remember having that conversation with someone, and she looked at me and she said, that is such an irrelevant question. The world is coming to an end. Why are you asking me what I'm going to study for college? You have failed us as parents. And so I think increasingly there are mental health professionals who are starting to think about, how do you address this? Obviously, as we saw in the chat, climate change is real. So you can't say it's not real, therefore don't be anxious about it. It is real, and being anxious about it and being nervous about it and being depressed about it and being realistic about it is important. But increasingly there's this hope that through community, through projects like this one, through joining forces and advocating, you can turn some of this despair into action and not let the despair dwell into a fatalistic thinking. So it's a really important fine line to support people who feel so anxious and depressed by it. They may need medical help, but realistically, we can't medicalize this problem. We can't say that all youth need to be put on antidepressants, because in fact, what we need is communities coming together and looking for ways to move forward. But, the climate anxiety and the eco-anxiety and the depression is something that I would love, during the Q&A at the end to talk about, to see what ways you have found to help yourselves, because I think we need to start talking about it. And the research on the mental health impacts of climate change is still evolving. So there's a lot to learn directly from the lived experience of young people. So I'm a social epidemiologist, and I'll take a second to explain what a social epidemiologist is. But fundamentally, it's someone who looks at the conditions outside of the healthcare system that impact our lives, whether it's our homes or our environment, whether it's our schools, the conditions of employment, poverty, all of that. But fundamentally, social epidemiologists care not just about health. So the CDC talked about, in generalities, we will see more asthma, we will see more cardiovascular disease, we will see more, diarrhea. But for social epidemiologists, we also care about the distribution of those health outcomes. So by that, we really talk about health equity and the fact that not everybody everywhere across the world is going to face the same climate risks on their health. And unfortunately, some populations have the means to protect themselves. For example, in extreme heat, if you live in a wealthy country where there are public libraries and public schools that have cooling centers, you have a place to go and cool down. If you live in a rural community in a poor country where air conditioning is unavailable and unaffordable to everyone, you clearly do not have the same solutions. So really thinking about health equity is at the core of a climate and health agenda. And, for me as a social epidemiologist, I think about health equity across different dimensions, between countries, within countries, and between generations. So this slide is really talking about the between countries health risks. So climate change, we know, harms poor countries, which are least responsible for the climate crisis. And really the health impacts, these same countries often have weaker public health infrastructure. They often have weaker medical infrastructure. So even just to the mental health piece, there are countries in this world that have single-digit mental health providers in terms of psychiatrists. And so, just medicalizing and saying everybody should have access to a mental health professional isn't going to solve for the fundamental inequities in the sort of healthcare workforce inequities that exist. But even thinking about the climate inequities, so Pakistan, I'm sure you remember the news when basically a third of the country was underwater. The health impacts of something like that, including, the impacts directly that happen from people drowning, but also the long-term health impacts. You lose your home. As a social epidemiologist, we know that sort of instability has many long-term health outcomes, but also waterborne diseases, diarrhea, food loss, food quality, all of that was huge. We also have reports saying that unchecked emissions may double child mortality due to heat in Africa, and that hunger, and I saw a few people in a heating world, that the climate crisis is fueling a real hunger crisis. So between countries, we need to be honest that the climate emergency is going to have different health impacts. And fundamentally, the climate crisis compounds or exacerbates existing inequalities. And that's important also when you think about within countries. So we are unequal at the global level. There are countries that are much wealthier and countries that don't have as many resources, but also within countries, within wealthy countries, we have populations that are living in much worse conditions. And within poorer countries, we have, again, populations that have very little access even to basic services and are really at risk. So some of the within country inequities that we need to be thinking about is that climate change disproportionately harms poor people and oppressed groups. And as Karina said in my introduction, I do a lot of work on structural racism. So if you see, the slide, people of color are far likelier to live in England's very high air pollution areas. The same is true in the United States, that people of color are facing truly a very different climate exposures, whether it's, due to air pollution or heat or due to other exposures, and not taking into account structural determinants and structural racism really doesn't allow us to think about solutions that would be equitable. There were a lot of reports from India that the farmers' suicides had been roaring, and that is a real direct impact of climate change and failure to provide both direct services to the farmers and indirectly the mental health supports that we talked about. And, I saw in the chat earlier, somebody talked about reproductive rights, and women and girls are expected to face a lot of challenges due to climate change, both directly and indirectly. But for example, and I'll talk about it later, because climate change is often leading to forced migration, during periods of migration, if you don't have access to water, or you're saving on the water because there's a drought, it's very difficult to take care of basic, sanitary needs. Menstruation and washing of products and washing of hands becomes more difficult. So the sort of unspoken challenges are also very real. So I talked a little bit about the direct impacts, but really a lot of people, including at the FXB Center, are starting to think about climate change and migration. And I'm obviously, as a health expert, I'm adding the health component. So we know that climate change is going to make increasingly number of places unlivable. They will be unlivable because of, for example, seawater rise if you live in a coastal community, or they may become unlivable because of the droughts make it impossible for people to farm the lands and be able to, have food. So food security, those are just two explanations. As lands and geography become unlivable, the expectation is that people will lose livelihoods, meaning they won't be able to work. They may try to move. Conflict will be on the rise. And some folks have been thinking about this sort of axis of mobility and choice. So as climate change makes your geography unlivable, what are your options? So one option is to move. And this important sort of axis of involuntary or voluntary is what we talk about distress displacement, people who move because they find themselves suddenly in, a flood or suddenly in a drought. And so they are forced to move because immediately. But there's also people who may be lucky or have the ability, the resources to use migration as adaptation, to recognize that, in 5-10 years, I will not be able to farm my land, so I will move to a new location. And of course, this centers into many conversations around migration policy, but we expect that millions of people will be moving in the years to come, both internally, so to different locations within their countries, and crossing borders. So when we think about health, displacement and migration both bring health considerations. Displacement brings very immediate health needs. People often are living in unsanitary, difficult conditions, overcrowding. So you worry about tuberculosis or other, communicable diseases. You often worry about, in cases of mass displacement, whether people have access to food and water and the basic necessities for health. But even with migration as adaptation, there are health challenges. For example, in many countries, you have, if you're living with, say, diabetes or living with cardiovascular disease, you have regular checkups, but the disruption that migration causes. Imagine you are recently pregnant and suddenly you are migrating. That displacement, that sort of migration can really force you to be in a new challenge, in the sense that you have no regular, you're on the move. You no longer can have prenatal care. You lose kind of that contact. For people who are living with chronic conditions, losing their medical records, all of that, or changing countries when you migrate across countries, not being able to transfer those records. So there are real challenges due to migration that happen, whether it's voluntary or involuntary. Now, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Now, the much, much harder situation is for trapped populations, those who basically are unable to move and have no choice. And for that, we are seeing, this is rare, but it happens, whether it's because you're trapped because you live in such extreme poverty that you can't move. You're trapped because you're on a border and the country next to you is not willing to open up. So despite hunger or extreme drought, you are not able to move. And often trapped populations rely on humanitarian assistance, the UN and other agencies going in to provide services, but that really is not a sustainable solution. And the final one is this in situ adaptation. And again, there are countries that are wealthier that are thinking about how do they change their conditions. So for example, in countries of the Gulf, thinking about desalination and really, recognizing that water is what is, really going to be the biggest climate pressure, finding ways to take salt out of the water, desalination, so that they can still have arable lands. Or other countries are wealthy, sort of Gulf countries are buying land in other countries to produce agriculture. So in situ adaptation, often we think about technology and new ideas in terms of making our geographies, adapting to that geography. And from a health perspective, in situ adaptation also includes things like, if you know that you're going to be flooding, don't put and you have a hospital that is at risk of flooding, change where your electrical, the in situ adaptation, for example, that New York did after Hurricane Sandy, when all the hospitals that were flooded basically lost electricity, was to move their electrical, supplies to the top of the roof. So there's in situ adaptation that can happen at the building level, at the city level, or at the country level. All right. So back to a question to the group. What do you see in this picture, and why is it relevant to our conversation on climate change and health equity? I want to ask you to either put it in the chat or jump in about what you're seeing, and how would you describe what you're seeing and what health risks this person who's in the picture might be facing. Simeon, I see your hand.
Okay, thank you very much, Natalia. So as for me, on the picture, I see a young girl coloring I can say a big, I think it's a water in it. So it seems like she's walking a distance way where she went to draw a water. So this is due to drought and scarcity of water. So this is very relevant to us as this conversation on climate and health, because we see even the effects of climate change or climate impact on even the gender. So she's a young girl and she's walking a long distance to fetch water. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Simeon. We have two more hands. I'm going to get everybody to speak. Joseph, you want to jump in?
What I've seen a young girl carrying water on her head, and I think according to this, I think the water is too big. No, the jerrycan is too big compared to her size. That's number one, which maybe may affect her body size in future. Maybe she might end up having maybe a stunted growth. That's number one. Then number two, I've seen the plants have dried up, and some of them have died up. Then I think it's basically due to drought.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joseph. And thank you for bringing the health, both the physical health challenges of, she seems very small and is carrying this huge, if you imagine it full of water, it must be very heavy. And I'm seeing in the chat, a lot of people are talking about the drought and the gender dimension. I do want to give Ayulu a chance to speak, and Chris also.
Thank you very much. I would also like to add to the points that were raised. We could see that this young girl is not wearing shoes, which means that she's like at the risk of like getting like injured. And these are like some sort indirectly linked to the climate crisis, because she wouldn't be fetching water, if there was like access to water from a long distance, So just wanted to add that there could be like a risk of like getting injured, like the insecurities related to her moving around because of the water. Thank you.
Thank you so much for pointing out that she's not wearing shoes. I think she's wearing some sandals, but yes, the risk of real injury just in that move. And we can imagine that she's probably walking this same path, if not every few days, every week. This isn't something. Chris, do you want to jump in too?
Go ahead, Chris. No.
Or maybe Chris took down their hand. Chris, if you don't, we can move to Saudat if you want to.
Okay, hello.
Hi.
I'm Saudat from Ghana, and what I can see is obviously, yes, the drought, and then how deserted her path is, and then how she's at risk of maybe certain animals like snakes or scorpions or all of that. So she's exposed to these, and with the jerrycan on her head, looking at the amount of water in it or the size of it, judging with the amount of water in it and carrying it, God knows the distance she's going to. And it might not be just one time. Maybe she would have to go like 2, 3, 4 times, because sometimes there's a jar, there's a barrel at home, and it has to get filled so that the household would be able to use it. So the number of times she's going back and forth, and here's a case that she doesn't have access to good drinking water, and then the family has to use the same water to cook, and then to process other things that the household will be able to use. So she's at risk of a whole lot, and she's highly exposed. And not to talk of the scorchy sun, because if the ground is this dry, then I can imagine the heat that is hitting her as she's going to and fro. So yes, that's the little I'd like to add to it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I want to highlight Elsa's comment in the chat that we don't know anything about the quality of the water. The water itself, we've been focusing on the girl, and the water itself might be contaminated. We don't know where she's picked up this water. She clearly, she's a young child. How would she know I mean, that if there has been a weather event or something, that there might be cholera or something in the water. Chris, do you want to try unmuting?
Okay, sorry about that. My network was acting up. So I want to highlight something that I see something completely different from just the little girl. If you take a look at the background, you see how highly polluted the background is, right? And if you take a closer look just behind the girl, slightly lower, using your mouse, there's like 3 stones, and then you can tell that there's a lot of pollution in between. This could be a sign that this is actually the environment that some of these guys could be living in. So you can just tell from the environment that there's not really much guarantee about the safety of the water that she's carrying, just from the environment that she's coming on, which is, I think, highly polluted. So yeah, that on its own can actually lead to some serious health problems.
Yes, that is really, really important. Pollution in the environment is a hint that there might be, and someone talked about excretion in the water that could cause cholera. We also haven't brought up the fact that she's walking alone. And so there are risks, as somebody mentioned, to snakes, but also from a gender-based violence perspective, there are moments where, women's safety and security and girls' safety and security is important in thinking about. And what the climate crisis is doing, most likely for this girl, is causing her walk to be much longer, reaching water. We have people in the education space, and I saw that in some of the chats, have been worried about, the roles that women and girls play in terms of cooking and cleaning and accessing water, that it means that some children might be pulled out of school to do these, to have these responsibilities. The reality is that as climate change makes our environment there's more drought, the length of time, the job that this girl has to do may become much harder. So thank you everybody for highlighting the gender inequities, as well as the obvious poverty, water quality, and physical potential heat stroke, potential injury, potential contamination due to drinking that polluted water. So we talked about inequities between countries and within countries, with gender being one that I wanted to highlight in the last slide. But when people think about climate change and equity, they talk about intergenerational equity. And intergenerational justice is about obligations. This is sort of a legal human rights frame. It's about obligations of current generations, so those of us who are alive today, not to pursue policies that create benefits for themselves, but impose costs on those who will live in the future. And it's really important, this framing is really important for wealthier countries. I think it's important to distinguish between benefits for themselves that are necessary for many countries in the global south, where there isn't even access to electricity yet, where people are still using coal or wood or dung to heat their homes or to cook. They need to continue to have access to electricity, and that may in times be at odds with kind of some of our climate policies. But for many parts of the world, including the US, including Europe, really intergenerational justice is about saying we have developed at a rate that has caused so much harm, and we need to stop for future generations. And why I'm hopeful is that there has been a real youth-led movement and countries that are being held, and governments that are being sued by their young people to do better. So that's one strategy that we can talk more about in the Q&A. So one more question, early on, I asked you to think about in what ways do you think climate change may impact your health or your friends. but I want you to now think about in the next 10 years, from what we've talked about now and a few more examples, in what ways do you think climate change may impact those most vulnerable in your community? So if you live in a city and in a wealthy neighborhood, think about what might be happening in a rural part of your country. Think about who is the most vulnerable. So I'd love for you in the chat to add, who are the most vulnerable people in your community? And we haven't talked about people with disabilities. I know earlier somebody had said, if you're blind or if you're in a wheelchair and there's a flood like this, in this image, what happens? What are the social precautions and how do you protect people who occupy certain vulnerabilities because of their status in society and because of the failures of our society to protect everyone? So take a minute to think about your community, and your community can be your country or your city or your rural area. Think who might be most at risk in terms of their health and because of the climate impacts, and put in the chat a couple sentences. Again, feel free to raise your hand. I love hearing directly from you. Feel free to raise your hand.
Natalia, as the advocates are answering, I'll just start. This is Karina. So I live on Staten Island, and certainly due to sea level rise and the strength of hurricanes, parts of my community will not be livable. For good chunks of Staten Island will not be able to have residents and houses because of climate change. So that's a real, and the people who have least resources and cannot afford insurance and have the most kind of vulnerable situations will be impacted the most by climate change in Staten Island. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karina. And you're absolutely right. And communities like in New York and in Boston are considering what are the ways in which to either adapt to the seawater rise by, physical barriers to the sea, or manage basically displacement, managing people buying their homes and giving them an opportunity to move inland more. I see 4 hands. I'm going to start with Rukshana, who I don't think has spoken yet. I think we heard from the other 3, and I want to invite people who haven't spoken yet to jump in. But of course, Simeon, Joseph, and Chris, I'll get to you also. But Rukshana, do you want to share?
Yes. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay. My answer is that I'm after 10 years. First of all, I live in Uzbekistan. I'm from Uzbekistan, honestly. And after 10 years, in my community, there will be the biggest air pollution because the capital of the Uzbekistan this year they ranked the first place of the air pollution and the most polluted area in the world. That's why, in my opinion, after 10 years, we will have the problems related to air pollution and the losing of water. In my hometown, honestly, my hometown do not have any kind of related problems with water, but after 10 years, maybe we will have, because the capital of the Uzbekistan have the same problem of kind of air pollution and also water pollution. But my hometown has a lot of water, that's why we don't have one. But after 10 years, we have kind of the problems and the impact. And I really want to remember one thing. In autumn days, I cannot breathe entirely in streets, and I cannot spend many hours in the streets because of air pollution, because many people do not care the other people's kind of burning waste. Yeah. It is kind of just ordinary thing in autumn days, but they burn waste and it caused me kind of breathing health problems. Yeah. And I cannot breathe. For example, in COVID-19, I did masks, but in that problem, I am wearing masks in order to not suffering, in order to not to suffer from air pollution.
Sorry, I didn't mean to go forward. Thank you so much. Yeah, air pollution is a huge one, and thank you for explaining also, yeah, people needing to sort of burn fuels. Nigina, do you want to jump in?
Go ahead, Nigina. I just lowered your hand, but you should be able to speak.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good evening, first of all. I'm from Uzbekistan, as Roxana. I guess that in 10 years, in most of areas is water scarcity is really challenging, like in Bukhara, in Zarafshan, in Nawai cities. People will try to leave these cities and try to find the other places for living. For instance, the scarcity of water nowadays is impact strongly to the Karakalpakstan areas, on the ground that in these places there was RLC, and now there is no RLC. And people have to leave their home. They try to move to the other cities, even into the countries, because the soil became unproductible. Its impact to the drought impacted the soil. The erosion brings to the problems with food scarcity, and it's also impact to the economics. As our country is a which is only developing countries. In the list of developing countries, we usually have some economic increases by selling our products like vegetables, fruits, etc. things. But I believe that in 10 years we couldn't even provide with food supply to our own markets. It will be really difficult for us.
Yep. Thank you so much. And that's really important. The economic impacts, they might be indirectly, like if food prices go up, then you might have malnutrition, not just because people can't access food because the quality of the food has changed, but because it becomes so expensive that you end up not eating fruits and vegetables in children. So Nayab, do you want to go ahead?
Absolutely. First of all, I would like to send my ambivalent accommodation to FXB for initiating this program. It means a lot. Dr. Natalia, I'm actually one of the most, I would say that I'm following your work for many years, and I'm so proud, and it's truly an honor for me to basically sitting here, learning from you and actually speaking to you one-on-one. So I'm following you since the age of 12. And when I won my National Youth Award in Pakistan for my research in climate action, I actually dedicated that award to you. So this is truly an honor. And Sir Richard, thank you so much for sitting here as well. I am also very fond of your work. And thank you so much, everybody, for initiating this. And I'm truly in complete awe. Secondly, I would just like to state that looking forward, I am poised to push boundaries in the field of climate tech. I am actively exploring the application of quantum computing since I'm an AI engineer and an environmental scientist. Recently, I did my PhD in bioengineering, and I'm aiming to unlock unprecedented levels of precision in climate projection, meaning that I'm investigating the potential of systematic biology and AI-assisted design to develop carbon sequestration materials. One of my projects in Pakistan was based on this particular concept, and basically it committed to forging a sustainable future and transcending the conventional solutions for the middle class and lower middle class income strata of Pakistan. So for me, I believe that even if things are pessimistic, we can do a lot to eradicate as much as possible and create a positive blueprint through our education and skill set, because at the end, I think climate change is a collective sort of impact that has been created by multifaceted elements, and we can change it if not for the next 100 years or so. We can change it as fast as possible by discussing about it, having awareness, and talking more than just about global warming, but actually the industries who are affecting that.
Yeah.
So for me, this is something that I really wanted to say. And again, I'm truly in complete awe and honor that I'm sitting here and discussing it with you all. Thank you so much
delighted.
for your time.
I'm so delighted to meet you, Nayab, and also Karina, I'm doing sort of a time check. Should we take all the comments or should we move to solutions? Because
Maybe
Nayab's...
move to solutions and then we can open up for the
Okay.
Q&A. We can have others share, since we have 30
so
minutes.
To everybody who I haven't called on yet, feel free to type in the chat. And I hope those of you who are looking at the chat, because there's such wealth and such great ideas that are coming in there from I've been sort of reading and listening at the same time, and that's really fantastic. And Karina, I hope you captured the chat at the end because there's so much wealth there.
Yes.
So, in thinking about solutions, it would be remiss of me to not mention COP28, which is happening at UAE in a few days. Karina will be there. And to sort of say that the world, what we've done in the first half of this lecture is really talk about the urgency and the importance. And as I wanted to make clear that the health impacts not only are real, but they're going to impact some community members differently than others. And therefore, when we think about solutions, we need to understand both the mechanisms through which health is impacted by climate change, but also the mechanism in which some people, whether it's due to their gender or poverty, will be more impacted. So, I don't know, I'm sure there's a mix of feelings in terms of how hopeful we are around COP, but I wanted to bring it up here because at the United Nations, at the global level, that is one thing we have, the way we move forward is around the Paris Agreement. I'm sure you've heard a little bit about that, so I'm not going to go into detail, but really the way that we think about solutions, and this might be a repetition for some of you, is that we categorize them either as mitigation efforts or as adaptation efforts. So mitigation is really about changing our practices, reducing our fossil fuel emissions in particular, and really saying that in order to reduce or prevent future emissions of greenhouse gases, we need to do something today. And here I have a quote that says mitigation can mean using new technologies, renewable energy, making older equipment more energy efficient, or changing management practices or consumer behavior. It can be as complex as a plan for a new city or as simple as improvements to cook stove design, and that there are efforts underway around the world ranging from high-tech subway systems to bicycle paths and walkways. And from a health perspective, I think it's really important to highlight that there are co-benefits, that you can do things, invest in public transportation, for example, or invest in bike paths that will reduce emissions because we use cars less, but they will also make us healthier because we know that walking and riding our bikes and using public transportation is much healthier than getting in our cars, especially in countries where there are high levels of obesity. So really thinking about climate mitigation as a win-win, as co-benefits between health and climate, is the way that a lot of the health practitioners are thinking about it, and saying, if you're a city and you can invest in, just a couple of things, pick the things that can have co-benefits for our health as well as for our environment. Now, what I've been talking about more today in terms of the direct impacts of the droughts and the, and the floods and the extreme weather events and the water quality, all of that is real and is going to happen whether or not we work to adapt whether or not we begin our, ambitious mitigation. And so what the health community is saying is we also need to adapt to this reality. Adaptation refers to adjustments in our ecological, our social, or our economic systems in response to the actual or expected climatic stimuli and their effect on or impacts. In simple terms, countries and communities need to develop solutions, they're called adaptation solutions, and implement action to respond to the impacts of climate change that are already happening, as well as prepare for the future impacts. And there is no one size fits all solution. And, you know, as before, some examples, it can range from building flood defenses. I talked about, you know, building kind of a seawall or setting up early warning systems for cyclones, or investing in drought-resistant crops, redesigning communication systems, and more. And while the UNFCCC talks about adaptation, some other people really talk about resilience. And what does it mean to build climate resilient communities? And for us in the health sector, what does it mean to adapt to ensure that our healthcare and our public health systems are really resilient to climate change? So I remember when I was working at the UN, the Minister of Health of Fiji came and said to me, you know, what can we do about creating technologies like our X-ray machines and things that are saltwater resistant? Because floods, they are expecting floods, but is there something that can be done to ensure that the hospital hardware doesn't get destroyed every time there's a flood? And so these sort of technological solutions are one way to thinking about it. Another thing that UNDP's health team was investing in is putting solar panels above basically storage for, you know, vaccines. So say you have antiretrovirals in a country that has a large, you know, population living with HIV, you need to ensure that the storage is at the right temperature. And so disruptions due to, you know, a disaster that would cause disruptions in electricity, or disruptions that, or basically in order to improve both mitigation and adaptation, they were investing in solar panels on top of these health clinics that would basically keep the vaccines cool. So there are, you know, small scale and large scale adaptation efforts, but really in protecting the health of people today and in the next 10 years will require a real investment in adaptation. So I have a video, and I don't know if this is going to work.
You may, Natalia, unless you.
I'm taking a stand.
Yeah, we can hear the sound.
Did it work?
It does work.
You can hear
Yes.
it? Okay.
Yes.
All
Yes.
right.
You may just
So
have to
this is a
maximize the screen. Mhm.
Okay, I'll I don't know. I
Once you
kind of
hit
embedded it, so
play.
I don't know if it
Oh.
will maximize.
Okay, yeah, we can see it.
It might not, because it doesn't matter, but I
Yeah.
wanted to highlight these are youth activists from like all of you on the screen. And the reason I'm showing you this video is to sort of encourage you to be using your voice. They're youth activists from around the world, either working on climate and health. They came together for a conference that we held at the Wellcome Trust in July 2019, so right before the pandemic. And this is sort of their highlights as to why climate and health matters to them. So I'm going to play it.
On the climate crisis because I want a better and safe planet.
I am taking a stand because I am from one of the most vulnerable countries, and it is very frustrating that none of it is our fault.
Within the first few weeks of starting medical school, I became aware that climate change is the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. And through that, I realized that no matter what I did clinically, that it would be overwhelmed by the impacts related to climate change.
Currently within the health space, we are seeing a lot of increase in diseases, for example, the non-communicable diseases, and a lot of mental health related issues.
We have increasing displacements, we have increasing heat, which all affect people's mental issues differently. From most of the conversations I've had with friends who work in the climate environment, the first thing that we talk about is the eco-anxiety that comes from people being afraid of what they could possibly experience in the future.
We've got a very small window of opportunity at the moment to do something, and not enough is being done to help tackle the climate crisis. We need to adapt and mitigate the effects of climate change.
Policymakers need to translate their commitments into actions because they have made commitments already, but they are not translating them into real actions in their countries.
We want governments to focus more on having public transportation, encouraging their citizens to consume less meat. We want intergovernmental bodies to have guidelines to follow up on governments, to follow up on national societies to encourage them to actually alleviate this climate crisis.
if policies can begin to look into more cleaner, healthy, safer methods for cooking, many people would benefit both from an environmental health perspective, but also human health perspective.
Now is the time to take action, especially at policy level. And I think that the more that we delay this, the faster the effects will be seen in many vulnerable populations.
I'd like to see more young people go out in the streets, meet politicians, meet these big industries, and tell them to stop, stop harming the planet, stop harming the people.
So that was a slide from, sorry. Oops, I went too far. So that was sort of, at the global level, what can we be doing? And what I think I'm really excited about is the youth mobilizing that is happening. The youth mobilizing that is cross-national, international, the fact that you come, this group of 100 people that are involved or more, the climate advocates is a larger number, but just those on the screen today, the fact that you can learn from each other, put pressure, because really climate change is a global challenge. But that doesn't mean that there isn't work that can be done at the local level. And for, a lot of the impacts are going to be felt by rural communities, but that also means that a lot of rural people are going to be moving to urban centers. We know that as part of the, mobility as adaptation that I talked about earlier, we expect cities across the world to become much larger, whether we're talking about cities in South Africa or cities in India or cities in, in the cities that you live. So it's really important to recognize that cities are both the cause and the solution. And I think a lot of the solutions are responsible for cities. So 55% of the global population currently lives in cities, but we expect it to reach 70% or even 80%. And also most of the greenhouse gas emissions derive from cities. And that's the buildings, the industry, it's the cars, it's, our lifestyles in those cities. But also 70% of cities are already dealing with the effects of climate change and are at risk. So it's fantastic to, sometimes thinking about solutions at the global level and the UN, and it can feel overwhelming. So I wanted to kind of delve down to the local level and what cities are doing. And so I'm going to ask you another question. What do you see in this picture, and why is it important from a climate and health perspective? And we're going to go through, I have a few of these slides, so we're going to go through this pretty quickly, and I'm only going to ask one person to speak out loud and share, because this isn't a trick question. It's just interesting to me that people might see different things and different actions that come out of that. So I'm looking into the chat. Solar panels in the city, solar panels. Okay, and why is it important from a climate and health perspective? Why are these solar panels important? And if anybody does want to share verbally, please do. Omar said, because it provides us renewable energy. Exactly. So it's a mitigation strategy, right? It's reducing our emissions. I see your point, Diana, about not really realizing, renewable energy that doesn't harm an environment, solar panels. Exactly. So it's clean energy, and why it's important from a health perspective. And of course, this is a very, high developed, an image of a city that in the background, we can see these large buildings, but we can imagine that solar panel could also improve in smaller cities or in places where clean energy, where we know that energy is impacting health. The fact that, many places in the world are using still fire to cook, and women and girls are cooking over fire or coal, and basically breathing in all those chemical and pollution. What this hope is, a transition to sustainable, clean energy, would have a direct impact on the health of people. All right, I'm going to move to the next slide. What do you see in this picture, and why is it important from a climate and health perspective? I don't know if it's obvious that it's an electric vehicle, but it is an electric vehicle. So it is public transportation, and I'm pretty sure this is also an electric bus. So I'm sticking to the clean energy and, thinking about transportation, public transportation, exactly. And I showed a bus instead of, a metro station or a train. Obviously, those are really equally important, but buses are often a low cost solution, and they still are much better than having, the 50 people on the bus taking their cars. You can see the cars parked in the back there. Or taxis possibly in the back there. Choosing to use public transportation is really important from a climate perspective, but it's also important from a health perspective, as I talked about, in terms of physical activity. If you're using a bus, you're much more likely to be physically active. And what I loved about this bus, it's handicap accessible, and it is, for people who may be older or using a cane, also signaling that it's a welcoming bus. It's a bus that isn't only serving able-bodied people. So I wanted to highlight this bus so we can have a bus that serves everybody in the community, including people with disabilities, a bus that is using electric energy, and a bus that prevents us from having to, and also somebody says reduces airborne diseases and global warming. Electric buses don't have the same exhausts. A lot of concern with buses has been like lead exposure for kids, especially near exhaust pipes. So cleaning the immediate environment. And equity. Thank you for highlighting that. So a lot of innovation is happening in cities, and this is, something that we should really embrace. There are, innovations at the very local building level, questions around, can white roofs help cool the world? Indonesia talking about a circular economy and not needing to sort of have the same consumption patterns where you buy new things and then you throw them away, when in fact you could reuse or upscale, or, so there are obviously at the global level countries that are trying to innovate with the circular economy, but at the very local level, at least in the United States, but I'm sure in other countries too, there is a shift in also sharing of things. For example, I'm a mom of 3 kids, and we have, a free sort of social media thing where you just, your kids, you get clothes from a family, not a family, as you would in the past, family members, but because of the social networks don't exist so much, your neighbors who might have older kids give you their clothes, you give your clothes to younger kids, kids grow out of their clothes within weeks or months, but this is one way to use kind of the circular economy to share and not to be, buying everything new. Cities are also investing in water recycling, gray water. They're investing in sponge cities and buildings. And I wanted to bring that up because my next slide has this, really creative sort of green forest buildings. So there is a lot of innovation that's happening. The problem is that we need to ensure that innovation is reaching everyone. So what do you see in this picture? Put it in the chat.
You're muted, Natalia.
Yes, I was coughing. Sorry, so I muted myself. You see, yes, housework. Someone is using wood to cook. Exactly. So the smoke, cardiovascular disease. So I wanted to end with this picture because my previous picture showed these kind of, cities that are glitzy and glamorous. From an equity perspective, we need to make sure that any technology that we're investing in is technology that really meets the needs of the poorest and most vulnerable in our communities, the women and girls who are doing the cook work, rural communities just as much as urban. Exactly. So for the healthcare sector, what role can we take? So I don't know if any of you are planning on becoming physicians or public health professionals, but something that the health community has been doing under the leadership of this group called Healthcare Without Harm is that, if we are doctors, if we are physicians, if we are healthcare providers, we need to make sure that our practices, the way we serve people, don't contribute to a harm to other people. So healthcare right now is a big emitter of emissions, 4.4% globally, which is pretty big. And, Healthcare Without Harm says that if the health sector were a country, it would be the 5th largest emitter on the planet. And that isn't to say that we can really change that radically, because some of the, the deliveries, if you're doing a surgery and you need to use anesthesia is often part of the reason. Like, you obviously need the health sector to pay attention to its emissions, but also some of it will be necessary. But, health systems around the country in the United States, but also around the globe, are making a commitment to pay attention to their emissions. And I think by walking the walk and saying, we're trying to green our sector, they can then also say, you need to do more around the world. And what we found is that healthcare professionals are really trusted individuals. So doctors and nurses are really good communicators around the health crisis. And so, the reason why climate and health is so important, and the reason why we at, schools of public health and medical schools are investing in training doctors about climate change, is both to better take care of their patients, but also to advocate, to become part of the solution for policy. So this is my last slide, I think, and we'll go to, it's a video, and we'll go to questions afterwards.
Can you tell me in your own words how you see the climate crisis affecting your country? What do you see is happening?
Cyclone Winston was the strongest cyclone ever struck Fiji. I saw houses blown away. Our school was destroyed.
I was visiting family back in Northern California when the Paradise Fire broke out. I had to roll up wet towels, put them under windows and doors, since the smoke was seeping into my home.
We heard voices screaming outside. We just stand outside praying for the fire not to reach our homes.
Many people died.
Our farms were destroyed. Our crops were washed away.
I really saw flooding and ice caps melting.
The summers are really, really hot. The snow melts immediately. In the rainy seasons, when it should rain, it doesn't rain. And sometimes it's raining that much that the river comes up to danger mark.
Every time we have these heavy rains, our school closes.
The economy is really impacted.
All the memories that were made in that place, like the places where we used to have fun and enjoy, are slowly disappearing.
I was on school and then I heard about climate change.
I saw many people talking about it on social media.
I started to see how communities were being impacted all around the world. And then I was asking myself, what was happening?
I just wanted to contribute and help out.
Who inspired me was Greta Thunberg. Greta and her movement.
She's just straight to the point and she's not afraid to speak up for what she believes.
My name is Greta Thunberg. I'm 16 years old. And I'm a climate activist from Sweden. I learned more and more about how serious the situation was. I couldn't understand why everyone else was just continuing like before, not doing anything, not caring about this.
We deserve a safe future, and we demand a safe future. Is that really too much to ask?
Adults look at us like us kids, and they don't really take us seriously.
Some people, they don't even think about it.
They're saying, oh, you're too young for this, you're not supposed to be doing this.
They don't really understand the climate crisis, so they need to know the climate science. What keeps me going despite the challenges is that I'm in solidarity with so many activists all around the world. All the other activists who are fighting every day, I think they inspire me a lot.
I want other young people not to think of how young are they or how small are they.
We can do something about this. If we really want to make a change, it's about every person individually. Our future, the kids' future will be affected.
It's happening right now. We're already late on our schedule.
We live in the same planet.
We have to come together. It's not an option.
As the climate crisis continues to get more urgent, we want you to all take action as well and make your voices heard too. I don't want to just stand aside and watch. I want to participate. I want to push as hard as I can in the right direction. And I've just decided to do everything I can.
So that was my last slide, as I promised. So I'm going to stop sharing. And thank you all for everything you do. I wanted to end with that video, because really what Karina has done by bringing together this group of climate advocates is exactly what we need to be doing for the planet. And, you know, it's not Greta. Greta is someone who has become the image of the climate movement in especially the global north, but there is a Greta in every country. There is a Greta in every community. And I think many of you are that future. And so my hope today, and also my hope with this program that I'm so excited about, is that you get some of the tools, some of the language, some of the technical, you know, to refer to some of the health challenges. You can refer to the CDC. There's something called the Lancet countdown that I can, you know, share with Karina, to share with you, to have some of the evidence. But realistically, the call is for you to just use your voice, be able to articulate what is, you know, what is happening, what you are seeing, because the lived experience, people hearing that this is happening now to your friends, to your family members, is really what is going to motivate change. And I'm so delighted that I am here. I apologize, I'm going to have to leave in like 10 minutes because my daughter has a performance that I have to go to. But Karina, I don't know if you want to take a couple questions and then maybe lead discussion even when I'm not here.
Yeah, so yeah, we have about 8 minutes with you. So I just want to make sure that someone who has not yet spoken has a chance to ask a question. So please raise your hand on Zoom, and I will, and then you can please say your name, where you're from, and ask your question. So Simeon, you've spoken. Let's just give someone else, someone we have not heard from yet.
And I see Omar's question, so I can start with that one.
Sure,
about
that
digital
sounds good.
technologies and social media. I mean, I think there is so much potential of social media to connect networks and activists. And even just now, you know, amongst yourselves, if you were to create a WhatsApp group, say at a regional level, you know, everybody who's from Africa or West Africa, everybody who's from the Arab states, and say, you know, how can we mobilize? I think a lot of the mobilization is happening using social media, and that's really exciting for me. I do also want to warn, though, that social media can be a really negative space, and climate activists on social media have been harassed and have been, you know, have been attacked. And so making sure that you do it in a place that protects and is safe for you is also really important.
Thank you. How about Pronto and then Yo-Yo? Go ahead, Pronto.
Hello, Doctor. Thank you for this interesting session. Actually, I'm Pranto from Bangladesh and working as the ambassador at FXB. So I want to know actually that you have talk about the climate change and health, and my personal research field is, my background is also from anthropology, and my personal research field is that I'm connecting climate change and the reproductive health, and how it is affecting the women's reproductive health in the South Asian region, specifically sexual and SRHR, sexual and reproductive health, right? So I want to know that in your locality, how did you explore about this, or what are the conditions in your locality about the climate change or the reproductive health programs?
That's a great question, Pronto. And I think sexual and reproductive health and the link to climate change is actually very understudied. There are some reports by UNFPA and UN Women that look about sexual and reproductive health, the impacts of climate change related to, for example, as I mentioned, you know, menstrual and hygiene, and, you know, during water scarcity, also during migration, loss of follow-up for people. There is more and more exposure that there are more studies, including at Harvard, around how air pollution and exposure in utero impacts the you know, low birth weight and other sort of challenges in terms of reproductive health. There's also the indirect ways. So climate change linked to violence and violence against women. We know that pregnant women are more likely to experience violence in the home. And during climate and heat, we know that there's an increase in violence. So there could be additional indirect processes. So there are many, but I would say I'm delighted that you're doing this work, because I do think it's still understudied. There's also the very direct question that links to mental health. A lot of women are choosing not to have children because of the climate, the eco-anxiety and the climate emergency. And that takes away a choice, right? We want people to be able to make reproductive choices. And if they feel that the climate emergency is forcing them to make a choice that they wouldn't want, I think that's also a mental health challenge that we don't often talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is also kind of some social norms, which is actually occurring some kind of violence. I did one of your article actually, what was published in 2012, the social norms and the social determinants, most probably the article title it was. And that's it. Thank you. Thank you
Thank
for
you,
this.
Franto. We'll take a question from Yo-Yo, and then we'll turn it over to Diana Phillips, the FXB USA board chair, to also say a few words. Yo-Yo, go ahead. Please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hello, my name is Yo-Yo and I am from San Diego, California. I wanted to say thank you, Dr. Natalia Linos, for this very inspiring session. I just had a quick question and I was curious to hear your input. I'm working on a climate project to spread awareness about climate change and how I can bring it into perspective to people who don't know. And I was wondering if you had any specific tips on how I specifically can spread awareness on climate change impacts on health equity based on your perspectives. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Yo-Yo. So I think, fundamentally, the health impacts, I think, are very good communication tools. So I think highlighting some of the, the issues that we've talked about today, and really, if you live in California, making it relevant to people in California, right? So I think it's important to think about the global inequities, but oftentimes people are not motivated by what they feel is happening, hundreds of miles away. So really being able to provide tangible ways that it's impacting your community or a neighboring community, whether it's pollution and air, and then saying, and of course, at the global scale, the challenges are much larger and we have a moral responsibility. I'm not saying that we shouldn't talk about that because it is really important for Americans, especially, to recognize the harm that is happening everywhere. But oftentimes communication, with lived experience and examples is the best way. And I think that health is a very powerful tool. We also have heard that some of the most I mentioned that nurses are good communicators, but we know that among Republicans in the US, actually 12 to 14-year-old girls are some of the most likely people to change the minds of their parents. So really knowing that you can make a change at the very local level in your family and beyond. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Linos. Now I would like to turn it over to Diana Phillips to just say a few words to end our session. Diana is FXB USA board chair, and thank you so much, Diana. Over to you. You're muted, Diana.
Thank you so much, Karina, and a special thanks to you, Natalia. This has been a really interesting, informative, and provocative discussion. I think all of us are going to be leaving here thinking about a little bit more about what we individually. We all have our own individual experiences. Obviously, you spoke about the heat in Boston and schools closing. Every one of the participants today has obviously got their own special experiences. We in New York experienced over the summer, and I think many people in the Northeast, these terrible air qualities that we all experienced from the fires in Canada. One of my sisters, who's a physical anthropologist, her name is Dr. Jane Phillips Conroy, who's also on this call, warned us a number of years ago that there was a pine beetle that was destroying the pine trees in the Southwest, and that because the climate was getting warmer and warmer and warmer, that beetle, which was not able to survive in cold climates, was now able to adapt and was moving east. And indeed, in the area where I am at the moment, the pine trees in this area, which is all the way east, have been devastated by this beetle that started off in the Southwest, and it is specifically related to climate change. So we all have evidence, we all have indications, we all have knowledge, and we all now have some tools. And I think the most important thing from this talk and from all of the programs that we provide at FXB USA is that each one of us can make a difference, and we all must be motivated to do exactly that. And your presentation, Natalia, has made us all think a little bit more about what we can each do as individuals. And there is indeed reason for hope, not despair, but for hope. And thank you so much again.
Thank you so much, Natalia, and thank you so much our advocates from joining around the world, sometimes in spite of many challenges around internet and time zone, but this was a really wonderful session, and I think it will really inform the climate action that our advocates are working on in their communities and globally. Thank you so much, everyone. We will share the PDF presentation of Natalia's slideshow, and also we will see you on Saturday, December 2nd for our last session. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.